Welcome to The Authority File, the podcast where you'll hear conversations with academic librarians, technologists, researchers, and authors whose work is laying the foundation for higher education's future. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice, and I'm excited to be speaking with Ron Williamson, who, along with Robert Von Bitter, co-edited the book The History and Archaeology of the Iroquois du Nord. The title is part of the University of Ottawa Press Mercury series, which is published in partnership with the Canadian Museum of History. The title offers a close examination of several village sites around the north shore of Lake Ontario established in the mid to late 17th century by the Haudenosaunee or Five Nations Iroquois. The title's contributors bring together Indigenous knowledge and recent archaeological findings that greatly advance the historical context of these sites, which, until now, have had very little written about them. This four-part series of The Authority File is brought to you by Ottawa University Press. In this third episode, we learn more about the historical context of the North Shore sites, the European influences, and the characteristics of the Haudenosaunee during that time period. So I'm wondering if you could provide some general historical context for these sites for us. What were the French doing at this point, and also the English and Dutch?
Sure. The history of this region is also complex, the European history of this region. We all know that the Norse were in Newfoundland around 1000 AD, but left and did not return. And we have lots of records of Basque presence, probably as early as the very late 15th century in the St. Lawrence Gulf area. And then there's better recorded European voyages in the St. Lawrence Valley, which leads into Lake Ontario, obviously. Lake Ontario drains into the St. Lawrence and then into the Atlantic. But the point is the St. Lawrence leads into the lower Great Lakes. So Jacques Cartier visited 3 times in the 1530s and early 40 in kind of the Quebec to Montreal corridor. And noted the presence of many nations, including people who were farming, who are known to us as St. Lawrence Iroquoians, and we have a good archaeological record of them. But when Champlain came later in that century and in the early 17th century, they seem to have dispersed. They had gone elsewhere. And in fact, we now know they had been absorbed by other nations, some into Ontario, into the Huron. And this is the period of the beginning of the Iroquois Wars, because the Mohawk and other Haudenosaunee nations were adopting some of those St. Lawrence Iroquois, and their dispersal may be due to the Iroquois or the Haudenosaunee trying to access European goods coming in through the French trade on the St. Lawrence River. And within literally 10 to 20 years, we have that European conflict between the French and the English mapped onto these local indigenous nations. The English and Dutch, and even at times Spanish, were also interested in exploring the East Coast for various reasons. And the English and Dutch had established colonies in the early 17th century, for example, Jamestown, that everybody knows about. But through the Haudenosaunee, the English had emerged in the Hudson Valley in Albany, and it was Albany to which the Haudenosaunee wanted all the furs directed. So you had this place that had first been settled by the Dutch. It was known as Fort Orange, I think, in the 1620s, but by the 1660s, it had been taken over by the English and renamed Albany. So you have the Iroquois, or the Haudenosaunee, supported by the British. You have the Huron-Wendat and all the Algonquin allies supported by the French. So you have the English-French wars being mapped onto these local nations. And so the wars, the Beaver Wars, become more intense. And in the 1640s, the Haudenosaunee literally take over all of southern Ontario. They push all of those people out of southern Ontario, adopting many of them, but pushing the Wendat in many directions. So it's an really interesting period for which you need to know both the indigenous history, but also that early European colonial history.
Yeah. So it's sounding like the Haudenosaunee were kind of doing this to sort of dominate the fur trade. Is that a way to put it? Or
Yeah,
yeah.
the traditional literature about the Beaver Wars is that a lot of it was about adoption of prisoners, which of course was true because we know of settlements among the Haudenosaunee that had largely Huron, Wendat, or neutral occupants. But in fact, in the 1640s, that whole conflict changed and became about
Mm,
eliminating the competition on the North Shore
mm,
with the wholesale destruction of sites. So it wasn't just kind of traditional feuding and replacement of prisoners for adoption. It became more about eliminating the competition in the North Shore and having access to the rich beaver grounds north of the North Shore of Lake Ontario.
mm. So these sites that your book is examining, were typically occupied for about 20 years. Does that have anything to do with the activities you were just describing? How are these villages used?
Well, it's interesting. These sites are satellites of the homeland. So the homeland is in the Finger Lakes region for the Five Nation Iroquois or the Haudenosaunee, and they set up these satellite villages, but they're very large. So
Mm,
they may have had four or five. Or even as many as 800 people living in them in 30 or 40 longhouses. So in fact, they're small towns and palisaded. They'd be worried about any possible, excursion by others to disturb them, but they would have been surrounded by maize fields. And if we think about it for a moment, let's just take 500 people as an example of a population of one of these small towns, like at Tayagon. Um, they're eating, we know from isotopic studies of diet, we know they're eating about a pound and a half of corn per day. So 500 people would have needed somewhere between 600 to 700 pounds of corn per day. So these
mm,
are large fields of maize being grown around these villages. And similarly, kind of annually, just to clothe themselves, they'd need, let's say, 2 or 3 deerskins for moccasins and clothing and other needs. So uh, that's also a lot of hunting that has to be done in order to clothe people. Now they're involved in a fur trade, so that's certainly helping. But they're also going to have been doing local hunting of deer, for example, to contribute in that. And of course, once those fields have been growing corn for, let's say, 12 to 15 years, they're starting to exhaust, and you have to move further afield to grow corn. And so they get exhausted. And it turns out that we don't really know whether that was a factor in the movement back to the homeland because the French in the 1680s were attacking the Iroquois homeland or the Haudenosaunee homeland. The Mississauga were moving southward from the north shore of Lake Huron for the first time into southern Ontario and were, in fact, attacking Haudenosaunee people. So there was both a push and a pull that ended up with the Haudenosaunee abandoning those satellite settlements, the IDN settlements. But after 20 years, which also just happens to be the point at which there would have had to have been a systemic movement of those villages to other places.
hmm Excellent. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about the Haudenosaunee. I mean, can you dive a little deeper into their characteristics? How did they tend to coexist with the other tribes, and their relationship with the Europeans?
Right. So Haudenosaunee history is like any other history of groups at this period, very complex and dynamic. It changed with time. But in the case of the Haudenosaunee, uh, current or most recent linguistic history and genetic history actually suggests that the origin of the Proto-Iroquoian language, so the language that all Iroquoian dialects emerged from, that language used about 4,000 years ago was probably in the Finger Lakes region of New York. So, and this is done through lexical studies. And so, if that's the case, then the language and probably maize as a way of life was dispersed from that region outward into the St. Lawrence Valley and into southern Ontario, the Neutral and the Huron-Wendat. And that probably happened in the well, let's say sometime between about AD 500 and AD 800, which leaves time for the Iroquoian language dialects to have evolved separately and for people to have adopted an agricultural way of life that we know started in New York State. The research by John Hart, a scholar in New York, has been absolutely essential in defining the kind of origin of maize horticulture. So then you get the Beaver War period, which is the Haudenosaunee becoming almost more imperialist, like the Comanches in the West. They really were pushing people. That reaches its height in the 1660s and 1680s after they've already dispersed the other Iroquois speakers in southern Ontario. But the other thing I think we need to note about the Haudenosaunee is that they were exceptionally gifted diplomats. In 1701, for example, they reached 3 independent treaties, and they were covering the ground. They reached treaties with other nations that said that they would share the resources that were north of Lake Ontario. They went to the Great Peace of Montreal, the Montreal 1701 Treaty, and they signed that treaty along with dozens of other nations, both Anishinaabe nations or Algonquian nations, and the Huron-Wendat and the Wyandot. And then the same year, they went to Albany and signed another treaty with Governor Nanfan, in which they provided a deed to the lands north of Lake Ontario. Curiously, most scholars believe that in 1701, when they signed that treaty, they didn't have control of that land. But you can imagine the diplomatic effort in signing 3 treaties. So I view the Haudenosaunee as very gifted and clever diplomats in that way. And I think this is something else we need to remember, is that the Haudenosaunee were exceptionally cosmopolitan. They had communities where the main language spoken was not a Haudenosaunee dialect, but something else. So there was one that the common language was Huron. There was another where a Jesuit recorded the main language in it was Neutral, and that's because most of the Neutral dispersed in 1651 from the west end of Lake Ontario ended up in a Haudenosaunee village where Neutral was spoken. And in the process, I'm sure, becoming bilingual and learning the language of the Seneca, the dialect of the Seneca. So exceptionally complex history, exceptionally gifted diplomats, but also with a very imperialist trend in the 1660s through 80s, where their dare I say, empire extended all the way to Hudson's Bay in the north and almost to the Mississippi in the west. They had already taken care of their Algonquian neighbors to the south. So these guys really were dominant figures in the 17th century.
You just heard from Ron Williamson. Ron is founder and senior associate of Archaeological Services, Inc., a private archaeological and cultural heritage consulting firm based in Ontario. He has also published extensively on Indigenous and early colonial Great Lakes history. This episode is brought to you with support from Ottawa University Press. Join us next week as we take a look ahead at the research on these sites that still remains to be done. We'll also look at specific examples of indigenous art and other materials from the sites that have helped advance our understanding of the mid-17th century Haudenosaunee culture and life. As always, underwriting opportunities for the Authority File podcast are directed by Choice's advertising manager Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced and edited by Choice's digital media producer Sabrina Kofer, with support from digital media assistant Ashley Roy. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.